Welcome to We Question and Learn. This is your host, Tom Pies. Our program on WQLN Radio is underwritten by Strategy Solutions, a business development firm that provides strategic planning, market research, and project management services to private corporations, faith and community-based nonprofits, and communities on the web at getstrategy.com. Very special guest today. We have Dr. Andrew Roth, scholar in residence at the Jefferson Educational Society. First of all, welcome.
Nice to be here with you, Tom.
Glad to see you at the round table. The Jefferson is your main bailiwick now, but you were the president emeritus at Notre Dame College for well over 15 years, a bit over 15 years.
Yes.
That's wonderful. St. Bonaventure University, another wonderful nationally known institution. We're certainly glad to have you here at the table. And your current activities involve the Jefferson Educational Society, am I right?
That's correct. I am quote unquote, I know we're on radio so people can't see me, just do the quote signs, but I'm quote unquote the scholar in residence, which people ask me, what does that mean? And I said, well, it's kind of like, and the college faculty members listening will get this, it's kind of like a college faculty member's fantasy job. I study whatever interests me, and my only obligation is to give talks and presentations, maybe occasionally write an article or do a program like this. And so that
the dream retirement job.
Yeah, in some ways it's the dream retirement job.
And of course, you had a long career at Gannon University and Mercyhurst University.
Yeah, I was in higher ed in Erie, most of it at Mercyhurst, but at both Gannon and Mercyhurst for, oh Lord, 33 years or something like that.
Wow. So there's no secrets in Erie relative to your career. And of course, we both participated in the SUNY, State University of New York system, but you went to the University of Buffalo, and, well, your Ph.D. is from there.
Yeah, in leadership.
All this culminates in a project that you're working on, initially, I believe, titled America in 1968, and if I have that title incorrect or if you've modified it or embellished it, we would be grateful to hear about that.
Well, the original, it's now undergone some changes. I counted them up last night thinking about today's program. I gave 17 talks I gave 17 talks in 2018 about 1968. The original title of the series was America in 1968. There's always colons in academic speak. America in 1968: The Far Side of the Moon and the Birth of the Culture Wars. The Far Side of the Moon refers to the fact that on Christmas Eve, 1968, Apollo 8 orbited the moon, and it was the first time in human history that humans saw the far side of the moon and Earthrise. And it was on that mission that the iconic photograph of Earth rising over the lunar landscape was taken, and everybody has seen that photograph now. It's arguably the most famous photograph ever taken, I guess you could, or it'd certainly be on the short list. But the less mythic and less positive aspect of all of that in 1968 was 1968 in some ways what was the flashpoint of the birth of the culture wars. The culture wars as a phrase, Pat Buchanan, and I guess depending on one's political persuasion, famous or infamous 1992 Republican convention speech in which he said there's a culture war, there's a war going on in America for the soul of America. And much of that can be traced back to 1968. As I say in the longer versions, things that happened in 1968 didn't necessarily so much cause the culture wars as they foreshadowed it. Some of the roots go way, way back in American history. Some of them go back only to the 50s and the McCarthy scare, the 40s and 50s and the Beats. But almost everything that has dominated American society in these past 50 years, you can find a foreshadowing, to use a softer word than cause, in 1968. For example, I boil that down, and the talk that you happen to hear me give was a kind of summation of the larger project, which is a 4-part multimedia review of 1968. But at both the Chautauqua Institution and then at the Roth Club in Cleveland and at a number of other places at the Siegel College at Case Western Reserve. I gave summary versions of it. Actually, the talk you heard at the Erie Rotary was a summary version of it. There's really about 6 things that were foreshadowed in 1968. I call the first one Politics is Theater, the politics of angry partisanship, of theater and angry partisanship. 1968 is a flashpoint in some ways, a watershed moment with race relations in America. It was the year, actually in some ways it would be 1967, but in 1968 it was the year that, at least on the public stage, the women's rights movement morphed into women's liberation. And it was also in 67, the summer of love, 67. In 68, you had the counterculture, the greening of America, the do your own thing, the hippie movement, if you will, to use a not particularly great signpost, blossomed completely, in which you had youth rebellion, which had both a political aspect, the anti-Vietnam War, but also a cultural aspect. Rapidly changing sexual mores, which possibly is the single most important thing that happened. And then the other things that were foreshadowed is music. I talk about the impact of rock music, and really to talk about that part of it in the absence of the music is going to be a little bit of a challenge for us, but we can talk about that generally. And then, interestingly enough, we're on one of the major media platforms in Erie, is the impact of media. Mediated American culture is older than 1968, but in 1968, America passed some cusp on mediated reality, and we've been dealing with that ever since. So that was that's the original project. How I got into it was really at St. Bonaventure. A colleague of mine, Phil Payne, in the history department at St. Bonaventure, Phil and I got talking one day about the fact that Americans seem to have lost a consensus on their story. Humans are storytellers. We tell ourselves stories to make sense of our experience, and we could get into a very sophisticated and very opaque conversation about what I mean by that, and there are people who would disagree with that to a certain extent. But what I mean by that is that one of the things that may in fact distinguish humans from other animals is, besides the fact that we apparently are sentient, although a lot of evidence might argue against that at times, is that we tell ourselves stories to make sense of our experience. And as our knowledge of human evolution and particularly cultural development gets deeper and richer, and as we compare ourselves to other species, many of whom also organize themselves in groups, in schools, in troops, the thing that perhaps distinguishes us from all of them is that we have this, as far as we know, and that's important to say, as far as we know, this unique ability to tell ourselves fictional stories that may come out of real, quote unquote real. I can see the Doridians in the audience wincing, that come out of real experience, but we translate these into fictional narratives that organize our experience to make sense of our experience, and then somehow we magically live by these stories and can in fact use the stories to impact physical reality. It's really, we could. I'm going to stop the deep dive into linguistic and narrative theory, but we're storytellers, and when you organize yourself into a society, there's stories societies tell. So we started talking. Phil Payne and I started talking about what is the American story. And I'm now currently working on a sequel to this America in 1968 on the American story. But we also at that time, realized, and this would have probably been around 2016, 2017, the winter of when Phil and I were having these conversations, that an anniversary was fast approaching. That 2018 was the 50th anniversary of 1968. And 1968 has rapidly become one of the most important years in American history. I mean, the definitive years in American history, 1607, 1621, 1630, 1756, the French and Indian War, 1765. I mean, you start rattling them off, but the obvious ones most people would know would be 1776 and perhaps 1941 Pearl Harbor. But 1968 is rapidly becoming one of those years because of everything that happened in it. Hannah Arendt, the great political philosopher of the late 20th century, she wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism. She wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem. Hannah Arendt once made the statement that it seems to me that the children of the next century will once learn about 1968 the way we learned about 1848. And of course, 1848 in European history is referred to as the springtime of nations, the year of revolution. Sitting here at WQLN and looking at a Victoria poster as I walked in, those people who are watching Victoria, the first 3 episodes, and I think probably episode 4 and 5 it's all about what happened in 1848. And the program does a little bit, but I suspect, if you don't know your history, some of what's going on might be a little puzzling with Palmerston and, what is actually going on. But it's all about the revolutions of 1848, the Paris Commune, etc. And all of those revolutions of 1848 in Europe failed. They were democratic revolutions. They had a direct impact on American history, though, because those who failed in Germany migrated to America, one of whom ended up in Chicago, and many of the Germans ended up in northern Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, one of whom was Karl Schurz, S-C-H-U-R-Z, and Karl Schurz was one of the people who was instrumental in the nomination of Abraham Lincoln. But what's important about 1848, it was the year of revolutions in Europe. All of those revolutions in the short term failed. They were democratic revolutions, anti-monarchical, but they signaled the beginning of the end of the age of monarchy, because we now know 70 years later, literally one biblical lifespan, the end of World War I, 1918, the only monarch left standing, as I say only, I immediately think that there were a couple of others, but the only monarch of any significance left standing was the British monarch. And as we know, the British monarchy has been a constitutional monarchy since 1688, and actually the monarch of England is politically not unimportant, but not, and their power is indirect and more persuasive and behind the scenes, but they're the last monarchy. So what Hannah Arendt's getting at is, did 1968 by some chance signal the beginning of the end of the age of democracy? And potentially the rise of anti-democratic. She would have thought the threat would have come from the left, but perhaps the rise of anti-democratic. And now, 50 years later, as we look at contemporary politics in America, and as we look at contemporary politics in Europe, we might say she was prescient. The jury's still out, but things that were set in motion both in America and also in Europe, because we're going to talk today about America, but 1968 was a major year of revolutionary upheaval in Europe, too. Daniel Cohn-Bendit, Danny the Red in Paris, the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany, and a number of other things. And again, all of those failed, just as the revolutions of 1848 failed in the short term. The jury's still out on their long-term impact. So that's what Hannah Arendt was getting at, that 1968 might be one of those signal years that signaled something. There's also a famous New Yorker cartoon, a young man being interviewed for a job, and he boasts to the job interviewer that he was born in 1968, a very prestigious year. And so you ask yourselves, why was 1968 a very prestigious year? On a very minor note, it's the year I graduated from college, so it has some import to me. Yeah. It's also the year 3 boomer presidents graduated from college. Bill Clinton graduated from Georgetown, George W. Bush graduated from Yale, and Donald Trump graduated from Penn. not exactly Washington, Lincoln, and Roosevelt. So those of boomers have a lot to account for. But that's why 1968 was important, and the 6 reasons, as I said, just to go over them again. Politics is theater. It was a benchmark watershed year on race relations in America. Women's rights morphed into women's liberation. The entire subtopic of the counterculture, which would be women's rights, gay rights, the sexual revolution, and also the politics of protest, which turned very violent, and then music and media. So that's how I got interested in it. Starting out being interested in taking a look at the American story, but going back to 1968 and looking at what happened that year that foreshadowed what we've been dealing with these past 50 years.
Have you written a book, or have you just created an outline that you present? You mentioned you presented this at the institution.
I've been giving a lot of thought of what to do with all of this, and one thing is to take the 1968 version and turn that into a book. There doesn't seem to be a definitive book. There are a number of books about it. Perhaps the most comprehensive and far and away the most readable was Charles Kaiser's America in 1968 or 1968 in America. I forget which way he had the title. But that was written in 1988, and a lot has happened in the intervening 30 years. And there are a number of books that deal with parts of it, and there is one or two that try to capture all of it, but not particularly well. So that's one thing. But I'm really more interested in using 1968 and the research I did as a springboard into the American story, into what is the American story. But first, maybe we should take a quick look at those 6 things that happened in 1968.
We talked before we went on the air how appropriate this will be, considering where we are today.
In the midst of all of the chaos, for lack of a better word or a more positive word, in our contemporary politics, the polarization is because of a divergence of opinion over what is the American story. But as a result of that, there's a lot of work being done at the moment on different people looking at precisely this. There's a number of interesting things that have looked at the cultural implications of current politics, and one of the things that people try to get their arms around is how do you explain the phenomena? And this is a nonpartisan comment. This is just an attempt to step back and be analytical. So, for anyone who's listening, how do you explain the phenomena of someone who voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary, and then voted for Donald Trump in the general election? And if you look at it from what is sometimes called the operational aspect of politics, it really doesn't seem to make any sense. The operational aspect of politics being how big should government be, what should be the appropriate tax rate, what should we spend on infrastructure, what's our policy on this, what should the minimum wage be, and all things like that. It just doesn't. But if you look at it at the symbolic level of politics, the level of cultural values, then it falls into place. David Brooks, in a New York Times column a couple of years ago, if you read the Times and have access to it electronically, I believe the title of the column is "The Coming War on Business," which at that time, this might have been in 2016 itself, actually. Brooks was talking about what he thought was going to be the coming attack on the technology of business: Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, as we were discussing, how Apple and Microsoft, and how we're in a period of time that's not real different from the robber barons. Not that Facebook and Microsoft are robber barons, but it's not much different from the age of trust busting in the 1890s, early 20th century. That you have a handful of companies in the high-tech business nowadays who have a disproportionate impact on GDP and have a disproportionate impact on American culture. And they kind of operate in a regulatory vacuum because the law has not caught up to their, the technology. The technology moves so fast We sit here in a radio station, just intellectual property rights and copyrights, and how do you protect that? For example, someone in the audience might be doing a PowerPoint presentation. I've done this whole 1968 thing. While you're doing your presentation and you decide you want to photograph, well, you click on Insert Online Picture, you enter your topic, and boom.
Boom, there it is. Yeah.
And if you're scrupulous and want to respect people's copyrights, the first thing that comes up is a series of pictures in the quote-unquote Creative Commons.
Yes.
That is, they're in the public domain and anybody can use them. If you click on the icon to turn that off, boom, up comes thousands of images, but some of those are owned in copyright.
Yeah.
So you click and cut and paste, and boom, you have this image in your presentation. Well, you've violated somebody's copyright. Now, they're probably not going to come after you if you're doing this in an elementary school or even a college classroom, because by the time they pay their lawyers' fees by the time they use a cannon to squash a gnat, it's not in their interest. But that would be one example of how the technology has just gone by. But in that article, Brooks referred to someone else, and I'm going to get back to the point here, and you can pull me back. I tend to go off on digressions, but like Tristram Shandy, I always get
those
back.
Those are the references.
I always get back to the main thread. It used to drive my staff crazy.
No, but for me, I always wonder where you get the base point, and now I'm understanding where it's coming.
But in this article, which, by the way, that war on business didn't really occur. I mean, there was some hearings, and we saw Facebook and Sheryl Sandberg and others, but it didn't. But in that article, Brooks had a link to a fellow who died in 1995 named Sam Francis. And Sam Francis was he was a curmudgeonly, unreconstructed, and I use that phrase intentionally, he was a curmudgeonly, unreconstructed Southerner. He came from an aristocratic family. His name was really Samuel Todd Francis. So I may have the number of greats wrong, but his great-great-great-aunt was Mary Todd Lincoln. He was an unrepentant Southern Reconstructionist. And he wrote an article. He died in 95 or 96, but he wrote an article shortly before he died in which he explained that the coming politics was going to be not a struggle over economic interest, but a struggle over cultural interest. And that when voters go into a booth, for the most part, in a Democratic election, they're interested in what are you going to do for me economically? If you use somewhat a layman using Maslow's hierarchy, survival, security, belongingness, esteem, self-actualization. Most people operate, at least politically, on survival and security, economic issues. But Francis had the insight to say that in a country that's as wealthy as we are, where even the definition of poverty is high compared to other places, which is not to diminish the pain of poverty. If people think you will vote their economic interest, even if you have cultural issues they don't agree with, they'll vote for you. If they think they can trust you to take care of them, protect them economically. And there would explain why someone might who's vehemently anti-abortion, well, maybe not vehemently, but anti-abortion, strike the modifier, might vote for a pro-labor Democrat because they trust that person to take care of them economically, and therefore the cultural issue is secondary. But, and this was Francis's great insight, but if they don't trust you or they don't have confidence that you'll take care of them economically, they atavistically revert to voting cultural values, which I thought about that, and I've talked with a number of people. That perfectly explains why the same person who would vote for Bernie Sanders would turn around and vote for Donald Trump. They trusted Sanders, perhaps naively, that would be a different discussion. They trusted Sanders to take care of them economically. He lost. They did not trust Hillary Clinton to take care of them economically, so they voted culture. Mm-hmm. Well, back to 1968, and a number of studies today. There's an interesting book, Pick Up or Prius, by two political scientists at North Carolina who talk about people with fixed versus fluid worldviews. And there's a new study by a group called incommon.org in New York that talks about cultural values and voting patterns. What you have happened coming out of 68, and again I want to go back to something we said at the very beginning, foreshadowed in 68, not necessarily caused by 68, but you can see the roots there, is that our politics has become less operational and much more symbolic. That most people don't vote on whether or not you're going to spend on infrastructure. Most people don't vote on trade policy unless they happen to be a corn farmer in Iowa who's now suffering because of tariffs. Most people vote on cultural issues, symbolic issues, the culture wars. And that is different, perhaps not in kind, but in degree over the course of American history. And so that we now have political arguments about culture values, abortion, same-sex marriage, the proper role of women, education. And we don't have arguments over what we used to have arguments about, the size of government. Now, some people do. But most people, and you find all of that, and those cultural arguments is the fragmenting and breaking down of the American story, or some consensus. Now, was there ever a consensus American story? That's a question. Are there multiple American stories? I think the answer is there are multiple American stories, but there was probably also a common thread. May take you back to Tom Paine and our creedal, C-R-E-E-D-A-L, American. One way I get at this is if you and I move to France, not to pick on the French, but if you and I move to France, and while it's chronologically impossible given our ages, but if you and I moved to France and lived there for 50 years, we'd never be Frenchmen. Right. At best, we would be a nice guy who speaks French with an American accent, who they kind of put up with. Yeah. And, and part of the problem in France today is they've not been able to assimilate the Algerians, which was once a colony. But in America, and it pains me to say it used to be, because I think what most people would want it to be is to be that way now, wherever you come from, if you buy into 4 or 5 basic creeds, concepts, values, hey, you're in. You believe in the rule of law. You believe in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. You believe, interestingly enough, some people might argue about this, in the value of a market economy, not necessarily a totally unregulated or regulated, but a mixed economy. You buy into that. I mean, that's one area where we constantly have somewhat a combination of operational and cultural arguments. And you believe and you agree to the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, which sometimes is called the American Creed, the famous one. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are, all men, Jefferson would have said, but all people are created equal, endowed with their Creator with the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
This is We Question and Learn with Tom Pies and Dr. Andrew Roth. We're in an incredible discussion. First of all, let me compliment you. I'm not sure how you store all this. As for the radio audience, I want them to know that you have very little paper in front of you and you haven't looked at much in this wonderful discussion, this education you've given us in the last 40 minutes. So we have 20 minutes to go in the program. And I'm just going to let you go and proceed on relative to America starting in 1968.
Well, we went off on that digression on America, about the American story, which, the interest in the American story is what got me interested in 1968. The American story is a much bigger issue, and maybe we can come back to that. But I mentioned Tristram Shandy earlier. The big digressions would always come back to the main thread. So maybe let's quickly go through what were those 6 things in 1968 that foreshadowed everything that's happened these last 50 years. The first one was politics is theater and angry partisanship. Well, Tom, politics as theater and angry partisanship didn't begin in 1968. No one would claim that. It's as old as Washington buying drinks when he was running for the House of Burgesses. It's as old as Tippecanoe and Tyler, too, Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, FDR and his $1 Million Smile. But if politics as theater and angry partisanship didn't begin in 1968, you might say 1968 was the year it blossomed. One might even say it had its conception in 1967, and it was born in all its fullness in Richard Nixon's 1968 campaign. In one of those chance meetings that bends history, in 1967 in the makeup room prepping for the Mike Douglas show, Richard Nixon met a young Roger Ailes. Nixon told Ailes he hated television with its phoniness and makeup. Ailes, a young man, at that time 25 or 26, with an eye on the main chance and the guts to grab it when it presented himself, told Nixon he didn't know what he was talking about, that he'd botched the 1960 election because he didn't understand television or how it worked, that television was the future and Ailes would teach him. Nixon, no one ever accused Nixon of being dumb. Nixon listened, hired Ailes, and, at the use of an old cliche, the rest is history, as Joe McGinnis recounts in The Selling of the Presidency, the Selling of the President. Ailes reinvented presidential politics as a variation on consumer advertising, and so it has been ever since. Ailes said Nixon would be the last politician elected president, that all the presidents going forward would be performers. Ailes invented the political infomercial with Nixon-imposed town hall meetings, answering prescribed questions from allegedly neutral or impartial citizens. Ailes created a set of advertisements in which Nixon was not present but did the voiceover, most famous of which is a lone woman walking down a dark and damp, rainy street at night with a voiceover talking about crime. And Nixon coming in at the end and saying, this time, vote as if your future depended upon it. That's not an operational issue. That's the beginning of symbolic politics. That's not Nixon and John F. Kennedy arguing about Quemoy and Matsu, which only a real political trivia nerd even knows what I just referred to in 1960. This is the politics of symbolism. In any event, Ailes recast the presidential election of '68, which began all about anti-Vietnam. It was all about the anti-Vietnam War. Ailes flipped the narrative and turned it into a campaign about law and order. It worked. Nixon won. We sit in a television show, we're having a talk. Every cable news talking head owes their career to William F. Buckley and Gore Vidal, whose acid-laced exchanges covering the 68th conventions invented a whole new genre of TV news. You can find them on YouTube where they literally cursed at one another. But that is beside the point. What the genre they invented was not news, but a kind of quasi-news commentary show in which the commentary then becomes the news, which subsequent news shows then debate, and a media version, I say, of a perpetual motion machine. In essence, it's one of the more banal but powerful examples of what Daniel Burstyn meant by a pseudo-event, a contrived situation sculpted to the media's requirements that then becomes its own story, which then finds its ultimate expression, I would say, in today's social media cluttered world in a president who tweets, which tweets then become the subject of the news, the analysis of which, an ever-expanding self-referential spiral, becomes the news of the day until the next tweet. There are at least three other implications of the 1968 presidential election that impacted American politics and American life these last 50 years. The first would be party purity. Prior to 1968, one could argue there are four parties in America. You probably remember this. Northern liberal Democrats and Southern conservative Democrats, Eastern liberal Republicans and Western conservative Republicans. Post-1968, we've had increasingly ideologically pure parties. Conservative Republicans, progressive liberal Democrats, with no need to bargain with one another. The old order required coalition building to get anything done, and the very nature of coalition building drives you to the middle. In the absence of the need to build coalitions, you end up staked out at poll points, and the only object is to destroy your opponent. That is essentially anti-democratic with a small d. That's not how the system is designed to work. The second thing that came out of 68 was the loss of faith in government. Now, I always say the anti-government sentiment in America is in the American DNA. We sometimes forget it, but we were founded in rebellion against the established order. We may be the world's first purely existential culture, which will take us back to the American story. But we're a culture that's constantly in the process of redefining itself. But the loss of faith in government, which predates 1968, all you have to do is listen to Ronald Reagan's comments supporting Barry Goldwater as recently as 64 to know that it predates 68. But 1968, America's never recovered from the twin hammers of Vietnam, of the war in Vietnam, in which we would discover that the government might be wrong about a policy, know it's wrong, and lie to protect itself. Or the second hammer of Watergate, which obviously didn't happen in 68, but Nixon gets elected in 68. Watergate happens, and the actual burglary happens in 72. But what we call the Watergate story is really 73 and 74, the investigations, the hearings, the impeachment, or, well, he was never actually impeached, but in which we learned that the highest levels of government could be involved in a criminal conspiracy and lie to cover it up. So what's come out of that is, although its origins, as I say, predate 1968, this loss of faith in governments led to continuous campaigns in which people campaign against the very idea of government. I'm going to drain the swamp. This is, by the way, nonpartisan or bipartisan. Both sides do this depending upon who's the out party at the moment. I think the right is a little more strident about it, but this is a nonpartisan comment that now to run for major state or national office is in some way to run against the very idea of government itself, which makes it difficult for government to govern. The third thing was the end of the liberal consensus. I actually point out there once was such a thing. It consisted of two macro concepts. In foreign policy, America's global role as protector of democracy and liberty, as chief restrainer of communism, and as chief arbiter of the world economic order. We no longer act as if we believe that's our role. And in domestic affairs, it was an essential, if uneasy, if at times very adversarial, but a kind of essential agreement that the basic monopoly board on which we were going to compete was some version of FDR's New Deal. That also went by the boards. That began to unravel post-1968, although, as I point out in a great irony, Richard Nixon, regardless of his campaign methods, governed as a centrist. In fact, I might go so far as to make the argument that Richard Nixon was the last liberal. It was Richard Nixon who started the EPA. It was Richard Nixon who started OSHA. It was Richard Nixon who invoked wage and price controls. Now, history abounds in these kinds of ironies that we sometimes don't see. The second thing that was of major import in 1968 was, and it still is, it is the main thread in American history, is race in America. In 1968, the civil rights progress of the 1950s, the late 1950s and early mid-1960s was checked and then stalled. The 1960s saw three great pieces of civil rights legislation. These are LBJ's triumphs, often obscured by Vietnam. In fact, if it weren't for Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson would probably be remembered as one of the two great civil rights presidents, the other being Abraham Lincoln. But because of Vietnam, this tends to be pushed to the back. And in recent years, as we get further away from Vietnam, and particularly as, quite frankly, the people who fought the Vietnam War, people of my vintage, become fewer, and that historic memory becomes less raw. Johnson is having a bit of a comeback or a bit of a renaissance because people realize on civil rights he was the real deal. And the three great civil rights acts of the 1960s were the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The 1968 presidential election began the slowing down of all that progress. As I said earlier, the election began all about Vietnam, but after LBJ withdrew from the race, and then the assassination of Martin Luther King, the ensuing nationwide urban riots, campus rebellions, most notably Columbia University, and then the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy and the riots at the Democratic National Convention. And all of this occurred within the context of a general rise in the crime rate. The crime rate from 1960 to 1968 almost doubled. It increased 98%. It almost doubled. Part of that is explained by the growth in population, but population between 60 and 68 only increased 11%. But most crimes, as you and I heard recently at a talk at Rotary by Diane Chido, most crimes are committed by males between the ages of roughly 15 and 30, 15 and 31. Well, in 1960, you had the leading edge of the baby boom. In 1961, a whole lot of males turned 15. And that number kept growing and growing and growing throughout the decade. Doesn't account for all of it. There's a number of other reasons, but that was a big one. In any event, the presidential campaign, because of this rising crime rate, because of political assassinations, I mean, we think our politics today are vicious. In 1968, we had 2 political assassinations, major urban riots, a major riot at the Democratic Convention, major riots and campus closures. Our politics today is verbally more violent in some ways than it was in 1968, but it's physically more peaceful. In fact, just as I hear myself talking, there may be, and a psychologist in the audience may want to either tell me I'm right or explain to me how I'm wrong, because I'm open to either position. But it just occurred to me, one benefit of cable news, we always talk about how it's polarized everything, might be is you let people vent, and the venting, well, it might inspire some fringe. For the bulk of people, the venting's enough. I don't know, just a random thought. But in any event, the campaign, it became less and less about Vietnam and more about the war at home. George Wallace openly exploited this, running on a strict law and order agenda. Wallace's shtick was thinly veiled anti-African American, maybe not so thinly veiled. Wallace was the president who famously said, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. In short, Wallace blamed black Americans and Northern liberals for the increasing lawlessness in American society, and his poll numbers peaked at 22% in September. Richard Nixon, to his credit, refused to out Wallace. Nixon ran a much subtler and much more effective, as we've mentioned, pro-law and order campaign. He argued the first duty of government was to protect its citizens. He made an alliance with Southern Democrats who found the National Democratic Party too liberal, too progressive on racial issues. Nixon never said he would revoke civil rights laws. He would just give them, in the terrible phrase, benign neglect. And he would go slow, and therefore Nixon became the first Republican to win the South ever. So he succeeded. So the key civil rights insights are the rise of the new Republicans in the South, the beginning of a retreat on civil rights, the lasting legacy of the Wallace campaign, in which we get a glimpse of 2 futures, Pat Buchanan and Donald Trump. The third thing is women's rights morphs into women's liberation. The women's movement dates back to Seneca Falls, New York in the 1840s, the suffragettes movements of the late 19th, early 20th century, which we just saw at the State of the Union address when the women members of the House of Representatives, and I believe also the women senators, wore white. And that was making, if you know your history, they were making a powerful political statement for women's rights and consciously identifying themselves with the suffragettes, who always wore white. But in 1968, the women's movement morphed from a kind of mainstream feminism to what became known as second wave feminism, a much more aggressive, much more assertive, much less genteel. Founded in 1967 by Robin Morgan, Carol Hannish, Shulamith Firestone, Pam Allen, and several other women. On January 15, 1968, the New York Radical Women's Coalition counter-protested the Jeanette Rankin Brigade. Jeanette Rankin, who was a suffragette, was the first woman ever elected to Congress, the only woman who voted for the 19th Amendment, for the good reason she was the only woman in Congress. 87-year-old Jeanette Rankin, a woman who just kept on going, had organized an anti-Vietnam War protest on Capitol Hill on January 15, 1968. The New York Radical Women's Coalition protested that Rankin, Coretta Scott King, Judy Collins et al. Were too ladylike in their and organized a counter-protest at Arlington National Cemetery, where they protested, where they held a funeral procession for traditional womanhood, lamenting womanhood's role in encouraging men to develop aggression to prove their masculinity. It was in a flyer she wrote promoting this protest, Kathy Sarachild coined the phrase, "Sisterhood is powerful." Probably more famously, in Atlantic City that fall, that September, the New York Radical Women's Coalition protested the Miss America pageant. Contrary to legend, they did not burn their bras. They had planned to burn their bras in a trash can, but when the police pointed out to them that the Atlantic City boardwalk is in fact boards, wood, they were prudent, not being complete, they're being prudent individuals. They agreed, okay, they weren't going to set any fires and trash cans on the boardwalk. But they did have a freedom trash can into which they symbolically threw objects that they said were symbols of female oppression, mops, dustpans, and bras and girdles. At the closing session on Saturday night, they unfurled a banner proclaiming women's liberation during the Miss America's acceptance speech. That was the first time that phrase had been given. It's not the first time it was used, but it was the first time it gained national exposure. Carol Hanisch later remarked that the media picked up on the women's lib thing and the bra burning. She joked that we often joked amongst ourselves, if they'd have called us girdle burners, every woman in America would have run to join us. And then the third thing that happened that year was the first Women's Lib Conference in Chicago. Usually I point out, other than the false myth of bra burning, in '68 the women's movement went largely unremarked upon, somewhat obscured by the year's more violent images. But I would say those women set in motion, and this is probably a partisan comment, set in motion a series of events that had the most positive impact of anything that happened that year. I mean, they literally changed the world. When I say they literally changed the world, we don't often think of Erie as having its pulse on the future. But in Erie, Pennsylvania, there was a moment in time in the 1990s when the two highest elected offices in the county were both held by women. The mayor of the city of Erie and the county executive were both women. I actually talked to Judy Lynch and Joyce Savacchio about this, and none of us are aware of any place else that that's true, but we're not going to say there is nowhere else because I haven't done the research. But if there are other places, there aren't many, certainly not in the 90s. One of those two offices is still occupied by a woman. Prior to 1968, that would have literally been impossible. Literally been impossible for that to have happened. The counterculture. I don't know what we can say in a couple of minutes about the counterculture of the 60s. There are two views of the counterculture, one positive about its legacy of inclusion and freedom, and the other negative about its glorification of an adolescent ethos incapable of mature responsibility. Whichever of those two sides you take, Bob Dylan's line remains true, the times they were a-changin'. The counterculture was driven by the children of prosperity. The counterculture itself grew out of the anti-Vietnam War protests, which were themselves inspired by the black student sit-ins and protests in the South. The counterculture morphed into a general protest against materialism, following Emerson's lead. They sought the blessed magic within each person. Like Whitman, they wanted to celebrate myself, to sing of myself, to do, in the parlance of the time, to do their own thing. Escaping into a soft haze, seeking enlightenment in a hash pipe, fulfillment in back-to-the-earth communal living, solace in experimental relationships, seeking grace in Eastern religions, and seeking satisfaction, as Mick Jagger famously said he couldn't get no, seeking satisfaction in sexual exploration. We're running short on time, and I don't know that we have time to go through the whole thing about the sexual revolution and everything that happened, but everyone of a certain vintage, certainly everyone who was alive in the 60s and subsequently has lived through one of the most epochal changes in human history. One could argue that it may be right up there with fire, whoever invented fire or figured out how to create artificial fire, besides lightning strikes. or whoever had the idea of cutting a cross-section of a log, or even just using a log to roll something on, and then whoever had the idea of saying, well, we could make this lighter by cutting a cross-section, bore a hole. In other words, whoever invented the wheel and axle. Yeah. And I would say probably right up there with that in terms of human history would be the invention of the pill, which happens in the early 60s, actually not 1968, but by 1968 it was generally available, with a prescription obviously, but it was becoming generally available. And that changed everything, because for the first time in human history, women could control their fertility, and that changed everything. And trying to understand the socio-cultural, to use a big fancy word, trying to understand the cultural impact of that fact resonates right down to today. We're still sorting that out. There was, of course, the drug culture. We can talk about that. There was also a wonderful blooming of civic involvement. Vista and the Peace Corps spoke to that. But there was also a violent undercurrent of political protest, the Days of Rage, the Weather People, who actually thought they were revolutionaries in their naivete. Mark Rudd, who, after he got out of prison, for a long time was an instructor of mathematics at a community college in Albuquerque, recently said we were hopeless. And I hope I'm not misquoting him on the rare chance that he might actually be listening, ever hear this, but he actually made a comment that if they weren't hopelessly naive, they were naive about, when you mount revolution, you tend to have just taken a fork in the road from which there's no going back, and don't be surprised if the other guy fights back. But you can't ignore that. And of course, all of this played out to a soundtrack of music, and we don't have time, and we could do a whole program on that, rock music. But the only thing I would venture to say about that quickly is that as I think about this, and I love this music. I mean, I'm as much of that product of that generation as anyone. I still think from time to time about a comment the social psychologist, the evolutionary psychologist Steven Pinker asked. Steven Pinker, in a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, asked the question, could it be that our parents and the earliest critics of rock and roll might have been right, or at least partially right? And what he's getting at is that you can't build a society on a foundation of disrespect for core values. In its purest form, rock is the music of rebellion. And in the music, you see a major part of what I call the essential American conundrum. How do you build a sustainable society upon a foundation of rebellion? We think of ourselves as an old culture. We have the oldest continuous democratic form of government, but as a culture, we're only 200, 250 years old. The Chinese have been a sense of Chinese culture for 6,000 years. So 200 years we're still in the infancy. And then, of course, the last thing is media. I think one of the things that comes out of 68 real quickly is two books every thinking American should read, or Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media and Daniel Burstyn's The Image. Now, McLuhan is opaque and almost unreadable, so I said you should read him. Maybe you need to read something that's a good summary of him, because but McLuhan was wrong about a lot of stuff, but he was right about the big thing. It's like Columbus thought he was in India. Freud discovered the unconscious, and everything else, all the details, they got wrong. McLuhan's a lot like that. He got most of the details wrong, but he got the big thing right. Mediums, which are channels in a communication system, are not neutral. They impose their own bias. They shape and sculpt. And then, of course, Daniel Burstyn's book, The Image, in which he talks about, and this will tie us into the American story, which we could possibly do in a follow-up a little more, that Americans live in a world of images. We tell ourselves stories. Sometimes our stories are anchored in reality. Sometimes our stories are tethered in make-believe. I always use as an example, and I'm not doing justice to Burstyn here as we come to the end of our time, but I always use an example of what Burstyn meant as an example of what Burstyn meant. If you were to go to the Cowboy Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City, in the main lobby, in the main entrance, there is a magnificent, maybe 8 or 10 foot tall statue of a cowboy. Except it's not a cowboy. It's John Wayne. in the archetypal image of a cowboy with his rifle and he's carrying a saddle. Now, John Wayne was not a cowboy. He was a movie actor. His name is Marion Morrison. His father was a pharmacist in Glendale, California. John Wayne went to Southern Cal on a football scholarship, hurt his back surfing, and for extra money decided with a couple of buddies to go over to this new thing, this is the early 20s, in Hollywood to see if they could pick up some money as extras. Well, it turns out John Wayne had some acting ability, and if you have not ever seen a picture of the young John Wayne when he was 22 or 23, and I'll let other people tell me if I'm right or wrong, he's an extraordinarily handsome guy. You might not think that if all you think of is the older guy with the classic shuffle, but he was an extraordinarily handsome guy. And he, of course, became John Wayne,
Yes. Yeah.
the movie star. But he's not a cowboy. He's not a real cowboy, because real cowboys were actually migrant farm workers. There was only about a 20-year window of time when they actually even existed. The image of cowboys are largely created by Ned Buntline and Bat Masterson and Wild Bill Cody, who was not a cowboy. He was a showman in the circus. And they created this whole image in these stories. There are a couple of archetypal incidents. There really was a Billy the Kid, and there really was a Wild Bill Hickok. But the point being that there were 2 or 3 of them, and their experience got generalized into an image, a pop culture image that has almost very little to do with the reality. If you really want to know what cowboys were like, read Willa Cather or on a senior moment, drawing a blank on the guy who wrote the great novels of the settling of Nebraska. Well, that's Cather in Nebraska, but the upper Midwest, Ole Rovag, I believe. I just butchered his name so someone will correct me. That's closer to what happened. So in any event, those are the 6 things that happened in 1968 that foreshadowed or contributed to the shattering of what I call the American story, or what I call the shattering of the American story. And I'm in good company with that, because this year, a year ago, the first issue of the 2018 issue of Smithsonian Magazine was called 1968, the Year America Shattered. And what shattered was the consensus on what is the American story? What is the story or stories that we tell ourselves that it means to be an American, and that holds us together as a culture? And that's going to be the focus of my continuing research on this topic.
Yeah. You just answered my next question. What do you see all this coming to, this whole fine piece of work you've accomplished here?
Well, I'm working on, and we're putting together what I think will be a 4 or 5 part series at the Jefferson over the next 6 to 18 months, and on the American story. And I'm going to be working with my friend and colleague Phil Payne at St. Bonaventure. In fact, I'm giving a talk to his class sometime this spring on this issues, and we'll see where it goes.
One last item. If someone wanted to communicate with you, offer you some information, or maybe just share a discussion with you, what's a good way to get a hold of you?
My email at the Jefferson, and I would be interested on anyone's take on what they think the American story is, whether they think I'm all wet, if they have any questions.
Or offer a compliment.
And my email at the Jefferson is all lowercase, Roth at jeserie.org.
Dr. Andrew Roth, thank you very much for participating on this WQON radio program.